Hey everyone, this is Will. I'm super excited in this video to show you how you can control your PTZ Optics camera using Playback running on your Mac. Now, when the PTZ Optics teams first announced this brand new MIDI control feature, I was super excited and I immediately saw the possibilities for churches and houses of worship that are running tracks on stage, particularly those using Playback on their Mac. Imagine the possibilities for a second. You're a drummer, a keyboardist, maybe a worship leader playing acoustic guitar. And when your song starts, your PTZ Optics camera immediately goes to focus on the person that's leading that song. At the end of your song set, once you're done, it sends a MIDI note and it moves your camera to widen out to show the whole stage as the speaker steps on stage. The possibilities really are endless and the setup is super easy to do. So in this video, I'm going to show you literally from ground zero to completion how to set this up using Playback on your Mac with your PTZ Optics camera. So let's dive in and talk about what we need in order to make this work. First thing is I have Playback for Mac running on my computer. I've got a Mac Mini that it's running on. It's important to mention a couple things. One, it's only available for Mac at the time of this recording. And then two, you need to have Playback Premium in order to use this on your Mac. Now, there's some various tiers on Multitrack site that include a copy of Playback Premium. But regardless, however you buy it or get it for free with another purchase, you've got to have Playback Premium in order to use and run Playback on your Mac. Second thing you need is your PTZ Optics camera. There's mine. Hello, there I am. And the most important thing with this camera is it's updated with the most recent firmware. And you can find more information and download the most recent firmware at ptzoptics.com. Now, I updated my camera a couple weeks ago, downloaded the firmware, and it took me maybe 3 minutes of that. It was a super easy process, and the PTZ Optics team has some great documentation to show you how to do that. Now, we've got Playback on Mac. We've got our PTZ Optics camera. How are we connecting these two? Well, first, I took an Ethernet cable from my Mac Mini and I plugged it into a network switch. Secondly, I took an Ethernet cable from my PTZ Optics camera and I plugged that into a network switch as well. And that put both of these devices on the same network. And here's the key. When I'm saying network, I don't mean internet. I just mean they're on the same network connection. And this is huge because this is what is going to allow us to be on stage running Playback off a Mac computer and have our camera located 200, 300, 400 feet away, maybe even a completely different room. And we can still have control over that camera because we're on the same network. So now let's talk about how we're going to log in and access our PTZ camera. Now you can use a Chrome or Edge web browser to do this. I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to use Chrome. And the way I'm going to do this is to log into my camera using the IP address of my camera. And I'm going to make sure I use a HTTPS secure connection. So I'm going to start typing in my browser here to build out this web link. And again, let's make sure it's secure connection. And I know the IP address of my camera, so I'm going to type it here, hit enter. Now, I'm going to get this message, and it's going to say, hey, your connection's not private. That's perfectly okay with me, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to bypass this in a second. But if this bothers you, if you're someone who wants to have an SSL certificate on your camera, if you know how to do that and that's important to you, then you can actually upload an SSL certificate on your camera. You can find more about how to do that at ptzoptics.com, and that will bypass this screen for you in the future. But let me show you how I'm going to do this. Now, again, I'm on Chrome on a Mac, so this may be a little different for you if you're on the Edge browser. But I'm going to click Advanced, and it says Proceed to my IP address there. Now, I'm just going to log into my camera, and this is going to give me access to the web UI. And once we're logged in, we want to go over to MIDI Control. This is where we're going to spend most of our time today. This is where all our settings for our computer and for all our MIDI control are going to take place. So now that we've got this pulled up, let's step back for a second and talk about how Playback on our Mac is going to communicate with our PTZ camera. Now, the way we're going to do this is to use something called a virtual MIDI bus. If you're on a Mac, then most often you're going to use the IC driver. This is a free utility that's installed on your Mac that comes when you purchase your Mac. If you're on a PC, you could look at Loop BE1 Virtual MIDI. Loop BE1, I have a tutorial video where I show you how to set that up on a Windows PC. If you need to set those up, pause this video, go set that up, and then come back and pick back up. If you've already set up the IEC driver, then you can pause, you can skip ahead to the next section. But really quickly, I want to show you how to set up the IEC driver on a Mac in case that's what you're using. So let's go and use Spotlight, which is Command, comma, and I'm going to type audio MIDI setup. I want to go up to the menu bar, and I want to choose the window option here. So I'm going to click window and do show MIDI studio. Now here's my IEC driver up at the top. So we're going to double click that. And you want to make sure that where it says devices online that you have enabled that and you have at least one bus or one port. Now, if you don't see a bus or a port show up there, then click that plus icon to have that show up and then hit apply. Okay, so let's close this out. The IEC driver is set up. Now the IEC driver is essentially going to function as, or your virtual MIDI bus, Loopbeat1 virtual MIDI is going to function as a virtual MIDI cable. So what we're going to do is out of Playback on our Mac, we're going to plug in our virtual MIDI cable. Then we're going to send MIDI from that into Chrome, and then Chrome is going to send MIDI commands on the network to our PTZ Optics camera. So let's walk through the setup here in each piece of this. Let's start with Playback because we want to send MIDI out of there. So I've got Playback for Mac open up on my computer. I'm going to go to the hamburger menu in the upper right-hand corner and click Settings. First thing I'm going to do, again, as a reminder, I have Playback Premium, which is why these options are showing up for me. So make sure you've done that already. I'm going to, under General, go to MIDI out, and I want to enable the MIDI out function. Next, let's click the MIDI tab here, and you'll see there's a bunch of buses that show up under this MIDI section here. They have some nice integration with Pro Presenter. If you're using Lyrics, you can use any of these other ones to send MIDI out of, but we're going to go ahead and jump down to aux1 because we don't see anything listed for camera here. And I want to go to aux1. And in this list, I'm going to click here. I'm going to choose IEC driver bus 1, which is what I'm using. We're going to leave this on channel 1, and we want to enable that. So now let's close this. We're set up for MIDI and Playback. We're going to have to do some work to add MIDI notes, but we're set up and enabled. Now let's set up our Chrome browser to receive MIDI notes. So let's go back to our web page here, our web UI with our MIDI control. And if you've enabled your IEC driver or set that up after you open this page, and just refresh the page. And under select MIDI controller, and with this drop down here, click this and choose your virtual MIDI bus, whatever that is. In my case, it's IEC driver bus 1. Then I'm going to click set MIDI controller. While I'm here, there's two really important things that I do. Number one, most important, is I click enable MIDI commands, and that's going to allow me to send MIDI commands to this web page that's then going to send these out to my camera. And the second most important thing that we should do is click display command mapping. What this is going to do, this is going to show you every command that's available to be controlled on your camera via MIDI. For example, right here, call preset 1. You could see by default, if I send a note on message with a MIDI note number 1, then that's going to call preset number 1. And call preset number 1 just means I'm going to go to preset number 1. So let's start with this. Let's just start with the most basic. How can I call preset number 1 on my PTZ Optics camera from Playback? So let's open up Playback. And let's add some MIDI information here. So to add MIDI notes in Playback, we're going to long press on edit here. We're going to go to MIDI cues. And I'm just going to scroll my waveform over. And I want to have this essentially just happen right at the, between our count off here, or our count in, and our intro. So we don't waste a lot of time waiting for this to come in. I'm going to press this plus button. We want to, under MIDI bus, essentially MIDI output, we want to choose aux1. Message, we're going to click here. We have note. Okay, and then value. This is one thing I don't like that Playback does. It doesn't tell me what MIDI note note number I'm using. I just happen to know that if I go here, C# -2 is MIDI note 1. Okay, so I'm going to select that and I'm going to hit done. Under this description, let's add a description here, and we'll call this call preset 1. This could come in handy later. Okay, so we'll hit add, and that's now added into Playback. So I'm going to hit done. Now, this is something important to note. This MIDI note has been saved locally on my computer, but because I don't have a Cloud Pro intro account with Multitrack's, this is not going to be synced across devices. So go to Multitrack's site if you want to sync this across devices. You have to have a Cloud Pro intro subscription. I'm just going to leave this locally on my device. That's fine at this point. Okay. So I've got my MIDI notes loaded in. You can see this little arrow. Let's see if we can move away from it. You can see that little MIDI note that's happening there. Now, before I press play, I want to mention one thing that's super important to check. Because we're using the IEC driver for playback from Mac, it's important that we make sure we haven't set up a MIDI feedback loop to where we're basically sending a MIDI note out that's then in turn triggering and controlling playback. So what you want to check before you go through this process is I'm going to go back up to edit. I'm going to click and hold, and I want to go to MIDI mapping. Just take a look at this page, see if you have anything mapped, particularly anything mapped to that same MIDI note that we had here. So we did C# -2. I want to make sure that, for instance, I don't have, loop or infinite loop or something mapped to that same functionality, because if I did, then it would trigger when I go into playback. If you have notes here, maybe delete them temporarily. We'll walk through this setup and then we'll talk about how to change this if there's any interference. Okay, so let's hit done. We're ready to go. I'm going to press play on this. Now I want to make sure that you can see, let's move this window. I want to make sure that you can see playback, and then you can also see the camera at the same time. So there we go. There I am. So we're going to press play. You'll notice right when we get to this intro, that's when we should trigger preset 1. So we'll press play. You'll hear playback through my speakers, and then here we go. There's preset 1, and you'll see our camera kind of slowly move into place, and I'm going to stop playback there. So again, it's a real simple demo there, but I hope you start to see the power of that. That's just one of my 5 presets that I can recall and pull up. Imagine going to the chorus of this song where maybe someone else is going to lead that section, and your camera is going to automatically move over to where that person is on stage. You don't have to rely on someone who's doing lyrics, who's in the tech booth, maybe running sound and hoping they can reach over and trigger that at the same time. You can save and create that preset and recall it directly from playback, which is really, really cool feature. Now, one other thing I want to show you while we're here. So that's how we can send MIDI notes to control that. We also have the option though to use control change messages, particularly for these sections, to set the speed of our pan, tilt, or zoom, to access absolute camera movements, either tilt up, tilt down, pan left, pan right. Also to access absolute zoom commands. And then we can access absolute pan and tilt full movement. And essentially, this is a little beyond this tutorial, but essentially I can say, okay, I want to go to a specific place in my pan, and I have access to the entire scope of the pan as well as tilt also. In order to access those, we need to send control changes. Let me show you how we would do that in playback. Then we'll talk about customizing our cues and how we would trigger those a specific way. Okay, so let's go into edit. And again, I'm going to click and hold, and I'm going to go to MIDI cues. And I want to, in this intro, so we have this intro calling up preset 1. I want to, starting right here, go to, I'm going to leave this on aux 1. The message I want to do is a control change message. And let's say what value I want this control change to be, okay? So let's go and see MIDI control change. Let's do a zoom, okay? So we're looking for control change number 23. All right, so we're gonna go here and say we're gonna do control change 23. All right, and then we'll hit done. And then velocity, this is kind of incorrect usage of this term. It's really a CC value. And then for velocity, instead of velocity, we mean what's the value of that. You'll see what I mean here in a second. So for this velocity, for this CC value, let's start with 0, okay? And we'll hit done, and we'll add this. This is a zoom. And then let's scroll over here. We'll do plus, control change. We'll keep this on 23. This time we'll go all the way up, okay? So we'll do 127, and then we'll hit add. Okay, let me hit done. We'll get out of this. Again, that's fine. We see that message. We're good. Let's press play. Again, let me show you our camera here so you can see we're on preset 1 right now. Actually, let's change this. Let's call up preset 2 just so you can see that. Super zoom. And then we'll go to preset 1, and then we're going to zoom wide, and then we're going to zoom tight. And I have us zooming all the way in, so it's going to be a little awkward, and we'll cut out of that as soon as we get there. Okay, so let's press play. We'll hear playback. Here comes preset 1, so we'll go a little wider right there, okay? Then we're gonna zoom all the way out, so that's our CC value, and then we're gonna zoom all the way in. We'll let that roll for a second. Super, super tight, super awkward. Okay, close enough. We don't need to see any closer than we were there. Okay, so that's how we can use not just MIDI notes and note on messages, but how we can also use CC values to call up commands as well too. But you remember, let me show you back over in playback. If you remember, we were talking about this. What happens if when I go to edit, and I go to MIDI mapping, I have a MIDI value mapped here that I'm using in playback that is also the default for this. Let's say to call preset 1, what if it's using some other value that I've already used? How can I change that? Let me show you how easy and simple it is to change these values and change the value that controls different features on your PTZ Optics camera. So first, let's say I know exactly what note I want this to be. So let's say instead of sending, let's make this simple on us. Instead of sending note 1, we want to send note 2 to change this. I would go to, what's the command over here? Call preset 1. We're still going to use a note on message. Let's say instead, again, instead of MIDI note 1, I'm going to use MIDI note 2. I'm going to click this and click map PTZ Optics commands to MIDI. And you'll see I get a little notification. Okay, event is note on MIDI button 2. That means that has been changed now. So if I change this to MIDI note number 2, then that is what's going to control that. But what if you find yourself in a situation where, much like using Playback, I'm looking at these notes and I'm not sure exactly what note is what. I'm picking a note, but I don't know what number it is. This is super simple as well too. So let's go into Playback and let's just pick something from scratch. So I'm going to do edit, MIDI cues. We'll drop something here at verse 1. We're going to set this back to note. Value, I have no clue what I'm going to pick here. Let's do F. And we'll do F7. Okay, so I have no idea what the MIDI note is for this, right? The number is for this. I just know it's F note F7. Okay, so let's play this. But before I do this, I'm going to go back to my web UI. I want to click this button here. This is a super important feature. Display MIDI commands in the browser. Watch what happens when I do this now. So let's press play. Again, this is going to happen right at our verse. So we'll press play here. And watch what happens as soon as we hit that MIDI note. So you see over in the browser, it says note on 113. So that's telling me that note that I'm sending from Playback. I don't know what number it is, but right here it's telling me it's number 113. So I would go up here and say, okay, 113, that's what we discovered. I'm going to click that. We're going to click map PTZ Optics commands to MIDI, and that is now saved. So this is a hugely beneficial feature. If you have a more complex scenario where you're MIDI mapping features in Playback on your Mac, but you then also want to send MIDI to your browser, this makes it super easy to customize and change those features so that you can map them to whatever you need them to be to make it work in your setup and scenario. So now let's talk about how we should actually integrate this with Playback. If I was you, I would start simple and start by simply recalling our 5 presets and set this up so that you could say, okay, maybe preset 1 is our general look when the band's on stage. And then we could go from song 1 to song 2 to 3 to 4. And we could use CC commands to actually adjust our camera. So we could say preset 1, and then for song 2, we're going to pan it to the right. Well, then on song 2, we could set a CC command to actually have our camera pan over. Song 3, we could have it pan back. And then when our speaker comes up, we could have maybe preset 2. We could recall that, which is a saved preset that's going to take us back to that. So I think by default, it's easiest to start working with presets. If from there you want to customize, have absolute control of where your camera is, either pan, tilt, or zoom, then you could add in those CC values sending from Playback on your Mac to control your PTZ Optics camera. Now, I hope you see how simple and easy it is to use Playback on your Mac to control your PTZ Optics camera. This opens up so many possibilities in a live house of worship church scenario to sync up your camera moves to your click and your tracks running in Playback. Now, to download the latest firmware, to get started, to see updates for your products and future new products, make sure you head to ptzoptics.com. There's so much good information there to get you started and to get you really excited about the possibilities of this. And then finally, I want to say thanks to Paul and the rest of the team at PTZ Optics. They have really created technology that allows churches and houses of worship to stay focused on what really matters, which is serving their congregation, reaching their people, as opposed to keeping their eyes on tech and stressing about tech. They're really making everyone's jobs and lives easier. So super thankful for that. Thanks so much for watching this video, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care, everyone. Bye.